Hello. Let's continue with Swami Rama and a call to humanity. A call to humanity, which is subtitled Revolutionary Thoughts on the Direction for Spiritual and Social Reform in Our Time. And we're going through chapter 1 right now, which dives right into the heart of what can be difficult and controversial, etc., entitled The Existence of God from a particular perspective here. And here we go. Let's see where we left off. The manifest world is pervaded by the subtle divine force. Like space, that force is abstract, expansive, and all-pervading. Without that force, nothing can exist and nothing can move. I'm pushing the button here to see who's there. Hi, Scott. Hello, Susan. Hi, Mary. Nothing can move. As our actions follow an inner inspiration, the movement of the cosmos follows the inspiration of the divine will. And note the way he's choosing the language here, that there's an all-pervading force. It reminds me actually a little bit of what is it, Star Wars and the little Yoda character, and all the people said, may the force be with you. It's this, note the choice of words here that Swami Rama is using. It's not saying that there's a him up there in the sky and that he is doing all this. It's this innate force itself. Hi, Nellie. I hope you're feeling better. Hello, Mike. Hi, Johnny. Whatever happens, whether in the microcosm or the macrocosm, it is inspired by the divine force that pervades all of the manifest and unmanifest reality. So it's the one absolute non-dual reality, by whatever name we choose to call it, and that totality is constantly manifesting outward. Although the divine force is one, indivisible, and all-pervading, it assumes multifarious forms and names. In the manifest world, the divine force transforms itself into energy and matter. Even modern physics accepts the transformation of matter into energy and vice versa. We're pretty much all familiar with that. We studied it in school. We may not be as sharp with it as the physicists, but we all have exposure to that. Merging with metaphysics, physics acknowledges the evolution of all known forces of the world from the more subtle force of an unknown reality. Modern physics has begun proposing the reality of an inexplicable but undeniable existence. And that word existence is an interesting choice of words too, because what we're talking about is existence itself, which is universal and infinite, which long ago had been set forth in the Upanishads. According to the Upanishads, the universe is an emanation of the divine force. All living and non-living, moving and non-moving, gross and subtle objects of the world are manifestations of that divine. All the known forces of the world function under the guidance of that divine force. And note here that that's just a choice of words, the divine force. Sages of the past devoted their lives to the study of the subtle world and received direct experience of divine illumination, without relying on perception, inference, or postulation, which is what we do out here in the world, is perception, inference, and postulation. Without relying on perception, inference, or postulation, without depending on material tools and instruments, they penetrated the multi-level truth through their fully illumined and one-pointed intellect. How do they do that? Through contemplation and meditation. The method through which they purified and trained their intellect is called sadhana, or spiritual practice, and we all know that word, sadhana. Through practice, they reached a state where their entire being was illumined with the light of the divine. Before discussing the nature of Shakti, which was introduced in the last section we did, it is important to know the relationship between Shakti and the individual self, little s self. It is crucial to know how individuals are related to the universe, how the inherent forces in the individual correspond with the forces of the cosmos, and ultimately how the individual's forces function independently in perfect harmony with the forces of the universe. That's kind of nice, isn't it? Independent, but in harmony with the universe. Sounds desirable. Moreover, what is that force which tries to unveil this whole mystery of knowing itself? What is that? How do we decide to know, and what are the means? According to the scriptures, the power of the will of the divine is the answer to all these questions. Except for this power of will, there is no other means to know the truth, big T truth. The power of knowledge and the power of action are energized through the power of will. All other powers, including the power of knowledge and the power of action, are inspired and guided by the power of will. And this happens constantly, all during the day for every one of us. There's a will, there's an intentionality way back in the depth of our being. It's as simple as the surge to have food, and that surge comes out through our levels of unconscious, and before you know it, we're having lunch. But it starts with that primary urge of will itself, way back in the depth. The study of Shakti, therefore, necessarily includes the study of the powers of will, knowledge, and action. And he doesn't say it here, but if you're curious, that's called Icha, Jhana, and Kriya. And their relationships. Through the will of the supreme divine force, a human being is inspired to know the truth. Without the will of the divine, all other forms in an individual remain inactive. By surrendering our desires, our personal desires, to the will of the divine, we find ourselves in the stream of divine consciousness. Note here the word stream of consciousness. So another way that some religionists will look at it is that there is a him, a being who is there, and his will over me is sarcastically said, it can be almost like a master-slave relationship, where it can look like the statement is there's a boss there and I'm merely the slave or the student, and I'm not supposed to have any wills or desires, but rather I'm supposed to listen to the boss. And I did that diversion there just to make this observation that you and I, each one of us, have, it seems to me, the innate right to choose which kind of perspective we want to hold with all of this stuff. So that's why I sort of sometimes pause in here and interject some ideas to stir your thinking, so that you are choosing how you personally live your own philosophy of life, your own worldview. All of our actions and psychophysical functions can be divided into two main categories: voluntary and involuntary. Functions based on our desires, decisions, and determination are voluntary, whereas the functions that take place naturally and spontaneously are not governed by our willful determination and are called involuntary. And so one of the things that we're trying to do in the yogic perspective is learn how to train the unconscious, not merely train our conscious mind, but to reprogram, so to speak, our deep unconscious called samskaras. This is what we're trying to do. Many of the bodily functions, such as blood circulation, heartbeat, and the contraction and expansion of the diaphragm and lungs, are involuntary. But through prolonged practice, a yogi can bring these involuntary functions under his voluntary control. Through yogic disciplines, a yogi recognizes his power of will, and then through the power of will, he becomes master of his body, and then ultimately of aspects of his mind. As he progresses with this discipline, he unveils the infinite field of his willpower and consequently attains mastery not only over his body, but his mind and the external world as well. At a certain stage of his sadhana, he realizes the oneness of the microcosm with the macrocosm. I am the microcosm, the person I call me, I'm the microcosm, and then there's the infinite one non-dual reality by whatever name we individually choose to call that, divine force or God or Brahman or simply unity. And so we're seeing that I am one with that. He realizes that the power of will is actually the power of the supreme divine force. Ego stands between the individual and the divine. By surrendering one's ego, one transcends the limitations imposed on the little s self, and consequently one's power of will becomes one with the power of the divine force. There's a very nice alignment. Nice, huh? Such a person attains perfection, since unrestrained power of will is at his disposal. Living in ignorance, and here we're referring to avidya, does not mean low IQ or lack of intelligence. It's that we're not seeing clearly the nature of ourselves in reality or truth. That's the meaning of ignorance here. Living in ignorance, most individuals are not aware of their infinite and inherent power of will. Hi, Larry. A greater part of their lives are governed by the force of nature. Human beings are constantly moved by their instinctual urges, desires, whims, and fancies. Very rarely are they able to hear the voice of the heart and therefore execute their power of will in carrying out the actions. Thus, they fail to put their whole heart into their actions and do not succeed. Their success and failure are governed by providence, which gives its judgment on the basis of a person's previous virtuous or non-virtuous deeds. So we assess ourselves based on our habit patterns, basically. In the case of an accomplished yogi, however, the process of knowing, deciding, making an effort, and reaching the goal originates from and is governed by his unrestricted power of will. So let us, you and I, please, let us train ourselves to move in the direction of being accomplished yogis. We may not be 100% at it, but we certainly can train ourselves to get better and better at that and move in the direction of being an accomplished yogi. One must not forget that the unrestricted power of will of a yogi has become one with the divine will. Therefore, it is not his will, but rather the will of the divine that inspires him to think, know, and achieve. And once again, we each get to decide which way we want to view that. There is a him somewhere, and it's a master-servant relationship, and he's the boss, and I'm following his instructions. Or there's the notion of this universal force, stream of consciousness is a phrase that I like to use. And so choose your own phrases. There's a universal stream of consciousness, and I find that I am operating more and more in alignment with that. Sometimes called living our dharma. So there's different languages and words, and we all get to absorb those words and ponder it ourselves, contemplate it on ourselves, and see which one of these words most resonates with that character called me. Human beings are still in the process of evolution. From birth to death, the power of will is being unfolded, and that is called growth. Yes. Goody, Scott, that it's coming. In some human beings, that power unfolds itself much more rapidly and significantly, whereas in others, it unfolds slowly and is barely noticeable. And for each of us, we may have different bursts and slow periods in our lives. People with relatively more unfolded willpower are known as great, and those with a fully unfolded will are called perfect. The Upanishads declare Atman cannot be known by those who are weak. In the scriptures, the power of will is also known as the power of sovereignty, to be sovereign. It is the self-illumined, self-guided power of consciousness. And here he uses uppercase C, which is like calling it Brahman or God or truth or reality. Because of that power, God is capable of creating, maintaining, and annihilating the universe. Three-part process: creating and maintaining and annihilating. And we see this all around. Everything comes into being, it's there for a while, and then it dissolves. Here I've used this before as an example. Here's a pen. It came into being in a pen factory by taking raw materials, and it came into being as a pen. It is a pen now. I can use it now. I think this pen is starting to run out of ink, so it's starting to be at the end of its life, and gradually it will go back in the trash, and in some way or another, it will dissolve itself back into the earth from which it came. Now, where was I? Without that force that is doing creating, maintaining, and annihilating, one cannot even stir. One cannot stir. It's saying that the pure potential of infinity does absolutely nothing without the potency of consciousness. Another way of saying that is that Shiva without Shakti is Shava. Shiva, the pure potential, without the manifesting consciousness called Shakti, is Shava. And Shava is a corpse, is inert. By knowing the nature of that great force, a scientist can discover the cause of the universe. He can come to understand the fundamental force and its relationship with the manifest world. Such a scientist is a sage, a master of inner science. He knows the path that leads to the kingdom of eternity, immortality, and supreme bliss. Unfortunately, modern science is still exploring the reality of the outside world and has paid no attention to the vast unknown part of reality. Yoga and Vedanta, two different but compatible branches of Indian spiritual lore, offer a complete system to work on oneself, turn one's mind inward, and discover the forgotten truth. By practicing yoga and contemplating Vedantic truth, and sometimes Vedantic truth is referred to as jnana yoga, which in itself is simply an aspect of yoga. An example of that is the text, the Bhagavad Gita. Many people say that the Bhagavad Gita, the 700 verses of the Bhagavad Gita, is a summary of Vedanta. But we can note that of those 700 verses, 80-something of them, over 1 out of 10 of those 700 verses, contains the word yoga. Intriguingly, and I mean this sincerely, only intriguingly, none of those 700 verses contains the word Vedanta. It's talking about the process of yoga. So please, never get confused over this usage of words yoga and Vedanta. They are so much companions that they are virtually the same, and a way of holding that is they are both yogic. So yoga, in some sense, while you can say, well, Upanishads come out of Vedanta and Yoga Sutras are yoga, you can make that comment. In another sense, they're all yoga. So I'm saying that to you. Just if you're not familiar with that, please don't let it throw you off. Don't get confused over that. Hello, Michael. As we practice, our power of will unfolds. However, this is an important point. However, merely collecting information about yogic discipline is not enough to experience the truth directly. And this is a real potential problem for all of us. It's very easy to just read books and just take classes and just sit together with me going through this stuff. It's very easy to accidentally do that because this is what we're trained, most of us, to do in school, in lesser school and in colleges. We are trained to take in information, study books, listen to lectures, take notes, memorize, and pass examinations. And we're all familiar with that. But it's not enough. Merely collecting information about yogic discipline is not enough to experience truth directly. We have to commit ourselves to an uninterrupted, prolonged sadhana, sincerely and faithfully. Sorry, my friends, we're stuck with that. Hi, Gene. We're all stuck with that. We have to do some aspect. Now, it's nice for us to I enjoy this a lot, and a lot of you enjoy it too. It's nice to come together a couple times a week and go through something like this and take it in. It's nice to have a book sitting on the little table beside your bed, or to have a couple books sitting in the toilet with you, so when you're sitting there doing your daily ablutions, you have something to look at. That's nice to do. It's nice to take it in. But the idea is we need to commit ourselves to uninterrupted, prolonged sadhana, sincerely and faithfully. So we're cultivating self-awareness, smriti, mindfulness, all day long, right through the middle of life. And in the doing of life, from time to time, in moments, we remember some little phrase, some little thing, and we see the way in which that is involved in my life today, right now. Which is why sometimes when we're going through these things together and we get to the end, I'll sometimes say, please, I hope you caught one little gem in what we just went through, one little tidbit that you can take with you for today. And so this is how we go about doing this thing, uninterrupted, prolonged sadhana, sincerely and faithfully. The truth that resides inside cannot be seen by an outward running mind. Now, if you're at work and you're doing your job in daily life, or you're cleaning house, or you're spending time with family, we are doing stuff out here in the world. This is not saying that we all have to go live as monks in caves or in the mountains, in sanctuaries or monasteries or anything like that. No, we live right out in the middle of life with family and coworkers and the world out here. But while we're doing that it's not outward running. That phrase he uses here, cannot be seen by an outward running mind. If the mind is in the habit of constantly, persistently, we all know what this is like, getting sucked in, dragged into all the crap of the world. That doesn't cut it. We have to do our actions in the world. That's inescapable. But what we want to do is remember the truth as best we can in those little fragments of gems during the day, internally, right while we are in the middle of doing our actions out there, whatever our particular personal actions are. This inward journey is possible when we purify our intellect and make it one-pointed. Through a purified and sharpened intellect, we can understand the relationship between the power of will, the soul, and the external world. Once this mystery is solved, we come to know the wonders of the power of will. That is impossible through worldly means. That which is impossible through worldly means becomes possible through willpower. Now, note here, too, that while we're saying we do this all right in the middle of life, there are times when we devote some time to study and going through a text on your own, or you're going through one of our Udemy courses or something like that. And we have a daily practice of meditation where we sit down intentionally and leave the world aside out there. But then we live this stuff in the middle of daily life. And sometimes we come together and do something like we're doing right now and have some form of communication here about what's going on. And at other times, we or somebody you meet face to face with a friend, or some of you I know well, we see each other sometimes. So there's face to face action in person, and you have a conversation, or you get together with us in the online table talks, and we have other conversation about. So all of these things work together, but we are attempting to live this internally right in the middle of daily life. In all the great traditions of the world, the power of will is described as the prime and inherent force of God. According to both Eastern and Western traditions, God did not create this world as a potter creating pots out of clay. Now, some of the religious views do look at that way, where it's like God did create the world in the way like a potter takes a pile of clay and forms it into a pot. There's a creator and there's a created, and so there's that process. Rather, he's pointing out here that in both Eastern and Western traditions, there is a perspective where God did not create this world in that kind of potter creating pots out of clay in that kind of way. Rather, the omniscient, almighty supreme consciousness simply thought, and that's a metaphor too, thought. Let there be a world, and there was a world. There's this natural, it's built into nature, however we may speculate that is, that plants naturally grow out of seeds. It's in the nature of the sun to shine. It's in the nature of life to move on. Let me, the one, become many, and out of one the world of multiplicity was evolved. This indicates the unrestricted power of the will of God. And note here that from this perspective, we don't have conflict between what is commonly called religion and that which is called science. For those who have the religious view that there is a him who made this, like the potter making the clay, and then we all kind of run into this in the world out here. There's some pretty significant conflict going on between the scientists, some of the scientists, and some of the more, some of the religious people. And from this perspective we're talking about, from the yogic perspective, there is no such conflict. Of course, the world is constantly manifesting and evolving and is constantly subject to change. No conflict. This indicates the unrestricted power of the will of God. In the history of Indian spirituality, one can find innumerable demonstrations of the power of will when great saints employed their yogic powers. The law of karma also operates through the willpower of the divine. The fruit of an action rests in the domain of divine willpower. At the time of its fruition, it is presented to the performer of the action, the karma is. In individuals, the willpower of the divine arranges the fruits of actions in the form of samskaras, which are stored in the unconscious mind, and then becomes the unconscious driving force behind that character, commonly called me. Got one of those? The result we obtain today is a consequence of the kind of action we performed in the past. Similarly, the action we perform today determines the result we will get in the future. Usually there is such a long interval of time between the performance of an action and its result that we forget the causal relationship between the action and its fruit. During that long interval, the causal relationship is maintained by the samskaras. They're sitting there in reserve, like the seeds are during the winter. And then in the spring and summer, the plants come again, and the grass comes again, and the weeds come again. They've been sitting in seed form. During that long interval, the causal relationship is maintained by the samskaras, the subtle impressions of past actions stored in the unconscious mind. The manner in which we think, speak, and act is imprinted on the vast screen of the unconscious, often called chitta, or in Yoga Sutras at one point is called the karmashaya. It's the field of the seeds of samskaras. Later, the unconscious impressions force us to think, speak, and act in such a way that we collect the fruits of our previous deeds. Frequently, what one thinks today is inspired by one's inner samskaras of previous thoughts. There cannot be a tree without a seed. And once the seed sprouts and grows into a tree, then usually there is no way to stop the tree from producing innumerable similar seeds. It just keeps feeding itself, doesn't it? We all kind of know that. However, one must not become discouraged and must not stop the quest. The karmic process is entirely based on the action of the performer. In order to burn, fire has to be ignited. Once it is ignited, the fire can burn only if someone puts fuel into it. Without the force that ignites the fire, fire is inactive and dormant and therefore cannot burn at all. Similarly, the karmic fire and its capacity to burn has to be brought into action by a higher force. The supreme divine force is the prime factor in igniting the karmic fire, and only after it is ignited does the rest of the process continue. Without the willful determination of God, a man born of flesh cannot move. This universal consciousness is moving outward. Driven by the power of the divine will, human beings rotate the karmic wheel. Out of ignorance, false identification, and attachment, they, the human beings, consider themselves to be the true performers of their actions and thus get caught in their self-created miseries. We fail to see, we simply forget, I like the word forget, we simply forget the fact that this pure consciousness is manifesting out through old habits called samskaras, and then they play out. And then I think that I am the performer of that. Because of their false identification, they impose limitations on themselves. Oh, I am so small. And do not know how to disentangle themselves from the miseries that they create. And this is what we're trying to do with our practices. Because of their limited awareness, nothing wrong. It's not saying we're bad people. It's just we have limited awareness. Because of limited awareness, they fail to observe the causal relationship between their action and the fruit thereof. We just don't see it. Thus, driven by the law of providence, they helplessly taste the fruits of their actions. Liberation lies in knowing the will of the divine, that ever-flowing stream of consciousness, and therefore realizing oneself to be an instrument in the hands of the divine. What else but the supreme divine force of God can unfold this universe? That goes back to this macrocosm and microcosm business. There's the little, there's the small, which is the microcosm, and there's the large, which is the macrocosm. This is where we end up with metaphors like the wave and the ocean. when you go out and you look at the ocean, there's this massive ocean moving, and you can watch with your eye, or you can go swimming, or you can go surfboarding or sailboarding or whatever, and you can feel the effect of a single ocean, of a single wave. And yet at the same time, we look at it another way and we go, wow, what an incredible ocean. So there's all these metaphors that help us see this. What else can establish law and order and peace and harmony throughout this widespread diversity? All this is diversity. The fact that we are individual, different human beings, that's simply diversity, but there's still one reality. We are individually part of macrocosm, and the other is we are microcosm, and the whole is macrocosm. The knowers of truth have realized that there is law and order throughout the universe. The sun, moon, stars, planets, and galaxies follow a law that scientists explain as the law of gravity or of attraction, but they do not understand what causes that force. According to the Upanishads, behind all the forces such as electricity, gravity, light, and nuclear energy, there exists an indivisible, universal force which defines the nature of the world and all of its functioning forces. That indivisible, eternal, all-pervading existence is called consciousness. Now, sometimes yogic term Sanskrit is called Atman, or the universal aspect is called Paramatman, or it's Brahman, or it's called Shakti. All that exists evolves from consciousness. Modern science is still confined to the study of matter and energy. So far, no one has done any research on consciousness itself. Now, within the field of science, I know some of you are familiar with this thing, but one scientist at a conference in 1994 it was a scientist conference. He pointed out that we, the scientists, we have figured out a lot about this external universe. And he said, what was the phrase? He said, but now that we understand so much about the universe, we come to see that these are actually easy. We have solved the easy problems. But the hard problem, that's the phrase, the hard problem that we have still not figured out is that of consciousness. What is the nature of consciousness? And as he talked about, he explained, how is it that we can perceive beauty in nature? How do we have that sort of aesthetic value? Is this only mechanics, or where does this consciousness come from? And so it's called the hard problem. And this came out of a scientist giving a talk at a conference. And then the terminology caught on, and then a whole bunch of people, which was not when this was written long prior to that. So within the scientific communities, there is a lot of conversation about the nature of consciousness. And you can Google the term hard problem of consciousness and find some stuff on it. Probably find some books on Amazon. The study of consciousness is the study of the self, big S self. When I went to my graduate school, some of you know I went to a graduate school in the 1980s, and the master's degree was in transpersonal psychology, but the name of the school, they've changed the name in the decades since then, because this was long ago. This was in the 80s, so that's 30 years ago, something like that. But the name of the school was the Graduate School of Consciousness. That was the name of the school. So they were studying consciousness, but this was mostly viewed through the perspective of direct experience and how you apply this in the spirit of psychology and transpersonal counseling. Anyway, the laws and forces of nature are part of the power of the will of consciousness. All functioning forces of the universe manifest from the will of the divine. In relation to the unmanifest divine, the power of the will is one and universal. But in relation to the multiple manifest world, the power of the will is also manifold. So there's one universal flow of consciousness, but as it comes outward, it appears to be many. So I have my will and each of you have your will. So there's an appearance of multiplicity. And there is multiplicity in some sense, but in other conversations we've talked, in some sense, this is an unreality because we have two coexisting realities. One is the appearance of multiplicity, and the other is the awareness of underlying unity. And if we have any perspective of underlying unity, you must, every system, every perspective that has a basic core view of unity must have some way to account for diversity. So it doesn't matter whether you call it Purusha and Prakriti. That's one of the ways. You can call it Brahman and Maya. You can call it Shiva and Shakti. You can call it Yin and Yang. You can look at many of the religious symbols and see that it's basically saying that the cross is considered, a murder weapon that was used to kill the founder of Christianity. But that same symbol of those lines like that previously was used to denote energies moving up and down and the balance of left and right. And so it wasn't a cross as a murder weapon. It was a way of denoting the balance of energies. And so there are many systems out there in our world. If we explore mysticism and like that, we can start to run into this, get some exposures. That the yogis of India, what we now know as India, are not the only people who have encountered and explored these things. That we know it as this overarching term called yoga, but the underlying principles and even we say this in yoga, they are universal. Anyway. I think let's pause there, and I'll come back, and next time we'll repeat that last little paragraph to get ourselves grounded in what we're talking about, and then we'll go on from here. This is pretty, you can go over this stuff over and over and over again, right? And hopefully, as I said earlier, some little tidbit. Hello, Hashim. Hello, Wouter. Hi, Virginia. Anyway, let's pause there for now. And again, I hope some little piece of what we went through today caught your attention in a personal kind of way that you can take with you during the rest of your day and maybe take it with you to your meditation seat later today or at the end of the day when you're doing your end of day meditation before going to bed. Thank you all for playing. And now, just for the fun of it, even if we have to pretend, let's pretend that we can get even the tiniest little intuition of the nature of this absolute one universal stream of consciousness. And let's pretend that we can literally find that, even for just a moment, in the silence, where we're going, that comes after an Om.